She drove 41 miles on a broken wagon axle, alone, in October cold, to enter a cooking contest nobody expected her to survive. When she set her pot down on that table, the judges actually laughed. One of them didn't bother hiding it. Martha Whitlock was 44 years old, wide in the shoulders, dirt under her fingernails, and she had buried a husband whose death never made sense to her. She wasn't there for a ribbon. She wasn't there for the prize money. She was there because a dead man's recipe was the only thread she had left. And she intended to pull it until something unraveled. Like and subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon listed hard to the left the entire last 8 miles. The rear axle grinding against the wheel housing with a sound like something in genuine pain. Martha Whitlock had wrapped a length of rawhide around the cracked wood back in Sulphur Creek, cinched it as tight as she could manage with cold, stiffened fingers, and told herself it would hold. It held. Barely. By the time the road widened into the main stretch of Caldwell Crossing, the wheel had worn the rawhide down to a thin curl of leather, and Martha was gripping the seatboard hard enough to leave impressions in the wood. She pulled the horse to a stop at the edge of the fairground and sat for a moment, looking at what she'd come 41 miles to reach. Caldwell Crossing's annual Frontier Cook-Off occupied the better part of the town's main field, a wide stretch of open ground behind the feed store that got used for cattle auctions in summer and nothing much in winter. Today it had been transformed into something that looked almost festive. Long canvas tents stretched over rows of iron cook stations, wood smoke curling up into the gray October sky, women in clean aprons moving purposefully between tables, men in their good coats standing around watching. There were flags on poles which struck Martha as a strange thing to bother with for a cooking competition. There was a raised platform at the far end where 3 men in suits sat at a long table with white cloth over it, and even from a distance Martha could see the particular posture of men who considered themselves important. She climbed down from the wagon. Her back ached from the road and her hands were stiff, and when her boots hit the ground she stood still for a second, letting her body remember that it wasn't moving anymore. Then she reached into the wagon bed and lifted out the cast iron pot, both hands under the bottom, and carried it toward the registration tent. The woman behind the registration table had a careful hairdo and an expression that shifted in a particular way when Martha walked up. Not rude exactly, just a recalibration, a quiet adjustment of expectations. She looked at Martha, then at the pot, then back at Martha. "Name?" she said. "Martha Whitlock, from Sulphur Creek." The woman found the name on her list, made a small check mark. "Category?" "Stew." "You're in tent 3. She paused. "You came alone?" "That's right." Another small pause. "It's quite a distance from Sulphur Creek." 41 miles, Martha said. "Is there something else I need to sign?" She signed the entry form and carried her pot to tent 3. Her station was between a woman named Agnes Collier, who had 3 daughters helping her, and a young woman Martha didn't know who had already laid out a full set of matching cookware with her initials painted on each piece. Martha set her pot down on the iron grate, checked the coals beneath. Someone had started them, but they were burning uneven, and spent the first 10 minutes coaxing the heat to something she could work with. She'd made the stew the night before. That was part of the recipe's particular quality. It needed to sit overnight, needed the flavors to settle into each other, and then it needed a slow rewarming on the day of serving. Her father had been very clear about that. He'd written it in the margins of the recipe card in that tight handwriting he used for things he considered important. Do not rush the second heat. This is where it becomes what it is. Her father had died 6 years ago. Her husband Thomas had died 11 months ago, and the recipe had been one of the few things she'd brought with her when she left the house they'd shared in Sulphur Creek. Not because it had monetary value, but because the card still had her father's handwriting on it. And because Thomas had loved that stew, and the two facts together made it feel like something she shouldn't abandon. She stirred the pot and waited. Around her the cook-off was building toward its midday judging, and Martha could feel the social dynamics of the place without having to pay close attention to them. The women who were known quantities, women with husbands present, women who'd won before, women who belonged to the circles that organized events like this, occupied a different kind of space than she did. They moved with ease. People greeted them. There was laughter and small talk and the comfortable noise of people who knew each other. Martha didn't know anyone. She was not by nature a woman who felt this as a wound. She was practical about it. She understood that she was an outsider here, that she was 44 and alone and had not made any particular effort with her appearance because she'd been on a broken wagon for 3 hours before dawn and had more immediate concerns. She understood that people were looking at her the way people look at things that seem slightly out of place, and she understood that the appropriate response was to ignore it and focus on the coals. But she was aware of it. She noticed the two women near the tent post who looked at her, and then looked at each other with a shared expression that said something without requiring words. She noticed the way Agnes Collier, who was pleasant enough in her direct interactions, introduced her to a mutual acquaintance as one of the other entrants from out of town with a specific inflection on other that was doing work it didn't need to do. And she noticed, most acutely, the three judges. They came through this tents at around 11 in the morning for what was called a preliminary review, a walkthrough to observe the cooking in progress before the formal tasting in the afternoon. The lead judge was a man named Hartwell Patterson, who Martha knew by reputation as someone who'd written pieces for the territorial paper about food and frontier living, and who clearly expected his reputation to precede him. He was accompanied by two men she didn't recognize, both in good coats, both carrying themselves like men accustomed to being in charge of rooms. Hartwell Patterson stopped at Martha's station for perhaps 45 seconds. He looked at the cast iron pot, which was old and showed it. He looked at Martha's setup, which was functional but had none of the visual presentation of the surrounding stations. He looked at Martha herself, and the corners of his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a frown, but was, she thought, the expression of a man who had already formed a conclusion. "Stew," he said. It was not a question. "Stew," she agreed. "Family recipe?" "My father's." He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been something else, and moved on to the next station. But Martha caught the look he exchanged with one of the other judges as they walked away. A sideways glance, brief, accompanied by the slight lift of one eyebrow. And she understood what it meant. She'd seen that exchange before. It was the look of men who had already dismissed you and were sharing the joke of it between themselves. She stirred her pot and kept the heat steady. By noon, the fairground had filled considerably. Families had come in from the surrounding area, drawn by the smoke and the noise and the general occasion of it. Children moved between the tent stakes. Men stood in groups near the beer that someone had set up at a table near the auction pen. There was a quality to the day that was almost celebratory, a frontier town making the most of a gathering, using a cooking competition as an excuse for the more fundamental pleasure of simply being together. Martha ate the bread she'd brought from home, drank water from her canteen, and watched her fire. The formal judging began at 1 o'clock. The judges worked their way through the tents in order, pausing at each station to take a portion of whatever was being offered, confer quietly, make marks in a ledger. Martha watched them work and tried to read nothing into their expressions, because reading expressions from across a tent was the kind of thing that made a person anxious for no useful reason. When Hartwell Patterson reached her station, he was accompanied by a crowd. This was partly because the judging itself had become a spectator event. There were perhaps 40 people following the judges through the tents at this point, curious and enjoying the drama of it, and partly because Martha was aware, with a kind of calm certainty, that her station had become a minor point of interest. The story of the woman who'd driven in alone on a broken wagon had circulated, the way stories circulate in small communities, and people were curious. Patterson looked at the pot. He looked at Martha. "Ready when you are," Martha said. She ladled a portion into the bowl she'd brought for the purpose. Patterson took the bowl, looked at it, looked at her, and then tasted it. The change in his expression was not dramatic. It was, if anything, a suppression of drama, a deliberate effort to keep his face composed that was itself revealing, because it was the face of a man controlling a reaction rather than not having one. He looked down at the bowl, then up, then he tasted it again. Something moved across his face that was not mockery, but it was the man behind him who made Martha's breath catch. She had noticed him when the judging party entered the tent. You would have to be deliberately not looking to miss him. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of genuine physical labor rather than appearance, dark-haired going gray at the temples, with the weathered face of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and at altitude. He wore good clothes, but wore them the way men wear good clothes when the occasion requires it, rather than because they're comfortable in them. He stood slightly apart from the group of followers, not quite part of the spectator crowd, not quite part of the judging party, just present. When Patterson stepped aside with his bowl, this man moved forward. He was not a judge. He didn't appear to have any official role. He simply moved to the front of the group with the quiet authority of a man unaccustomed to being stopped, and he looked at Martha. "May I?" he said. It was not precisely a request, but it wasn't arrogant either. It was just a man asking for something he clearly intended to have regardless. "Help yourself," Martha said, and pushed the ladle toward him. He ladled his own portion, which she noted. Most men waited for a woman to serve them. He looked at the stew for a moment, then tasted it, and then he went completely still. It was not the stillness of enjoyment, though she'd seen that too, the small pause of pleasure when food was good. This was different. This was the stillness of a man who had been struck by something, who was standing in a fairground tent in Wyoming holding a bowl of stew and looking at nothing, his eyes focused on some point about 6 inches past the visible world. Martha watched him. He tasted it again, slowly, like a man checking his own perception against itself. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Shock, she thought, but shock wrapped around something older and more complicated, something that had been sitting in him for a long time. "Where did you get this recipe?" he said. His voice was quiet. The crowd around them had gone slightly attentive, sensing that something had shifted, though probably none of them could have said what. "It was my father's," Martha said. "Same as I told the judge. Your father's name." It was not a polite question. It was not even entirely a question. It was closer to a demand, and the intensity of it surprised her, though she kept her face level. "Richard Hale," she said. "He died 6 years ago. Who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the bowl again, like the answer he was looking for might still be in there somewhere. Then he set the bowl carefully on the edge of her station table, which struck her as a man's gesture of setting something precious down. "Gideon Blackthorne," he said. "I run the mountain lodge east of Timber Pass." She knew the name vaguely, the way you know names of local landmarks. Blackthorne's Lodge was the kind of place people mentioned in passing as a reference point, a landmark in the landscape of the territory. A cattle operation, she thought, or had been. She'd never had occasion to think about it more specifically than that. "Does the name mean something to you?" she asked. "The stew does," he said. And then, like a man choosing words with unusual care, "My mother used to make something like this. Exactly like this. The way the broth sits, the ratio of the dried herbs, the particular—" He stopped, looked at her. "My mother disappeared 20 years ago." Martha heard this, and something in her chest shifted, though she kept her face still. "I'm sorry to hear it," she said. "Are you?" It wasn't accusatory, just examining. He was watching her the way she was watching him, with the careful attention of a person trying to understand what they were actually looking at. Around them, the crowd had gone quiet, in that particular way crowds go quiet when they sense they're witnessing something private that has become briefly public. Hartwell Patterson was looking at them both with an expression that had shifted from mild condescension to genuine puzzlement. Martha picked up her ladle and turned back to her pot, not because she was done with the conversation, but because she needed a moment to think. And stirring was something to do with her hands while she thought. The recipe had come from her father. Her father had gotten it somewhere, though he'd never been specific about where. He'd said it was something he'd encountered in his traveling years, before he settled in Sulphur Creek, before he married Martha's mother. He'd never named a source. She'd never thought to ask, the way you don't think to ask about the origins of ordinary things. Thomas had loved it. Thomas, who died 11 months ago in what the county recorder's office had called an accident, a fall in the mountains east of Sulphur Creek, working a supply route for the Halverson Company. A man alone on a mountain path, a fall, the kind of thing that happened to men in the territory with enough frequency that there was no particular reason to investigate it further. Martha had investigated it anyway. Not loudly, not officially, but she had asked questions in the way that a quiet woman could ask questions without appearing to ask them. Talking to men who'd worked the same route, listening carefully to what people said and didn't say, following a trail of small inconsistencies that didn't add up to anything she could prove, but that felt, in the specific way of a woman who had known her husband for 18 years, deeply wrong. The recipe card had been in Thomas's pocket, when they brought him back. She hadn't understood why. She'd thought she had the card at home, in the kitchen, where it always lived. But there had been a second copy, she'd realized, one Thomas had made himself, and she didn't know when or why he'd made it or why he'd been carrying it. She still didn't know. But the card had led her here, in the way that following small, inexplicable things sometimes leads you somewhere you couldn't have mapped in advance. "You said your mother disappeared," Martha said, still stirring. "What do you mean by that exactly?" Gideon Blackthorne was quiet for a moment. When she glanced back at him, he was looking at her with an expression that had settled into something harder to read. Not the shock of before, but something more deliberate. "She went to work for a supply company," he said. "Running their accounts, she was good with numbers. Halverson's outfit." Martha's hand tightened on the ladle. "The Halverson Company," she said carefully. "That's right." He paused. "She sent a letter saying she'd found something wrong in their records, something she was going to report. That was the last letter. After that," he spread his hands, a gesture that meant the obvious thing. "They said she left on her own, wandered off into the mountains, the way they put it. Nobody believed it. Nobody did anything about it either." Martha turned to face him fully now. The crowd around them had mostly dispersed, the judging had moved on, and the spectacle was over, and people had other things to claim their attention. But she and Gideon Blackthorne stood at her station in the relative quiet of Tent 3, and she looked at him, and she made a decision. "The Halverson Company," she said again. "My husband worked their supply route. He died 11 months ago. They called it an accident." Something moved in Gideon's face. His jaw tightened and then released, and then he was very still again. But this time it was a different kind of still. Not the shock of the stew, but the stillness of a man putting pieces together. "How long had he been working for them?" Gideon asked. 8 months. He took the work because the pay was better than anything else available. He'd been asking questions about some discrepancies he'd noticed in the supply numbers. He mentioned it in his letters. He wasn't trying to cause trouble, he just... She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He was an honest man. He thought if you noticed something wrong, you reported it." "Yes," Gideon said quietly. "That's what my mother thought too." They looked at each other across the cast-iron pot with the steam still rising from it. A 44-year-old widow and a rancher 20 years into his grief, two people who had come to a cooking competition in Caldwell Crossing carrying entirely different purposes and had found them pointing in the same direction. "I'm not here for the blue ribbon," Martha said. "I didn't think you were." He picked up his bowl again, looked at it. "I've been trying to find something solid on Halverson's operation for 12 years. I have suspicions, and I have a dead mother, and I have nothing that any territorial court would take seriously." He looked at her. "You said your husband was looking at supply numbers?" "I have his letters. I have some notes he kept. Nothing conclusive." "Where are you staying in Caldwell Crossing?" "I'm not staying. I was going to drive back tonight." "On that wagon." "The axle held this far." He almost smiled. Not quite, but something moved in his face that was in the neighborhood of a smile. "I have a room at the crossing house. There's a dining room. If you'd be willing to talk." He paused. "I'd like to hear about your husband." Martha thought about the drive back in the dark, the grinding axle, the cold. She thought about the look on this man's face when he'd tasted her father's stew and gone still as a stone. "I'll need to stable the horse," she said. "I'll cover it," he said, and held up a hand before she could object. "Not charity. Consider it the price of conversation." She did not win the cook-off. Hartwell Patterson gave the blue ribbon to Agnes Collier's venison pie, which was, Martha allowed, a very good venison pie. He gave Martha third place, which surprised her, and when he handed her the ribbon, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite parse, something between reluctant respect and continued condescension. The face of a man who has been forced to revise a judgment slightly and is not entirely comfortable with it. "Your stew is unusual," he said. "The flavor profile is remarkably complex for a frontier preparation." "My father was a particular man," Martha said, and took the ribbon and put it in her coat pocket and did not think about it again. She stabled her horse at the livery on 5th Street, as Gideon had directed, and found him already at a corner table in the Crossing House dining room when she arrived. He'd ordered coffee for both of them, which she appreciated, and he stood when she came in, which she noted but didn't remark on. They sat across from each other in the wood-paneled dining room with the fire going and the smell of roasted meat coming from somewhere in the back. And for the first 2 minutes, neither of them spoke. Martha had spent enough of her life in the company of difficult conversations to know that sometimes you had to let a silence settle before you could build anything useful in it. "Tell me about the recipe," Gideon said finally. "Not the stew itself, the card. Where your father kept it, how specific it was, anything you remember about where he said it came from." Martha told him what she knew, which was not much. Her father had traveled widely before settling in Sulphur Creek. He'd worked mining operations, logging camps, cattle drives, the various forms of itinerant labor that carried men across the territory in the years before the railroads made everything more fixed. He'd picked up the recipe somewhere in those years, he'd said, from someone who cooked it for a camp, and he'd written it down because it was the best thing he'd eaten in a month of Sundays, and he didn't want to lose it. "He never named who he got it from," Gideon said. "Not that I remember. He might have told my mother, but she's been dead 16 years. Gideon was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, not drinking it, just moving it. "My mother's name was Clara Blackthorne. She was a meticulous woman, kept records of everything, receipts, letters, accounts. When she worked for Halverson, she kept a private ledger alongside the official one because she didn't trust the official numbers, and she wanted her own record of discrepancies." He looked up. "They never found that ledger. After she disappeared, I went through everything I could access, and there was no private ledger." "You think they took it?" "I think they took it and destroyed it, yes. But I also think—" He stopped, looked at his coffee again. "I think she may have copied things. Pages. She was the kind of woman who made copies of important things, who kept records in more than one place." He looked up. "Did your father ever mention a woman named Clara? Or work with any outfit connected to Halverson in the logging or mining years?" Martha thought carefully. Her father had told many stories of his traveling years, the kind of stories men tell their children about the life before domesticity, adventures and hardships and characters encountered along the way. She sorted through what she could remember, looking for something that fit the shape of what Gideon was describing. "He mentioned a woman once," she said slowly. "He talked about her like she was, I don't know, exceptional. Someone he'd encountered briefly and thought about for a long time afterward. He said she had a mind like a trap and a heart that was too honest for the company she was keeping." Martha paused. "He said she'd given him something to carry, and that he'd carry it as long as he needed to, and that someday maybe it would matter." Gideon had gone very still again. "He said she'd given him something to carry," he repeated. "Those were his words. I thought it was, I don't know, a metaphor, a figure of speech. He was a man who liked figures of speech." "Or not a metaphor," Gideon said. "Or not," Martha agreed. They looked at each other. The fire crackled. Someone in the kitchen dropped something heavy and swore, and the sound of it briefly broke the silence, and then the silence closed back over them. "I have my father's things," Martha said. "I haven't gone through all of them. After he died, I packed the boxes and put them in the back room, and I wasn't ready. Then Thomas died, and there was everything that came with that, and I still haven't." She paused. "I don't know what's in those boxes, but there might be something." "There might be something," she agreed. Gideon picked up his coffee cup finally and drank from it. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I have a proposition for you. Nothing that requires an immediate answer. I'd just like you to consider it." He set the cup down. "I'm looking for a cook for the Mountain Lodge. My current cook is leaving at month's end. He has family in Denver he needs to get back to. The position comes with room and board, a reasonable wage, and—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "Access." "Access to what?" "To the men who come through the lodge. Railroad executives, contractors, company owners. Men who know things about Halverson's operation, men who work with it or work adjacent to it, men who talk more freely at a dinner table than they would in a formal inquiry." He looked at her steadily. "You're someone people overlook. I don't mean that unkindly. I mean that you have a quality that makes people comfortable saying things they might not otherwise say because they don't consider you a threat. That quality has value." Martha considered this. She thought about the drive back to Sulphur Creek, the quiet house, the boxes in the back room she hadn't opened, the job she'd been doing at the Hendersons' farm for a wage that covered her needs but not much beyond them. She thought about Thomas's letters, the ones that mentioned discrepancies in the supply numbers, the ones that had made her uneasy in ways she couldn't name at the time. She thought about the look on Gideon Blackthorne's face when he'd tasted her father's stew and the 20 years it had clearly been sitting on him. "I have a wagon with a cracked axle," she said. "I'll have someone look at it tonight. And I'll need to go back to Sulphur Creek to collect my father's things. Those boxes. I can send someone to help, or you can take the time you need." "I'm not a woman who needs help lifting boxes," she said, and something in her voice made him look at her more carefully, and she thought she saw, in that brief reassessment, the beginning of something like genuine respect. "I didn't think you were," he said. Outside, the October wind had picked up, and the last light was going gray and cold beyond the dining room windows. The cook-off was over, the crowds dispersing to their homes and farms, and Martha Whitlock sat in the crossing house with her third-place ribbon in her pocket and a cast-iron pot in her wagon and 41 miles of broken road between her and the house where she'd lived for 18 years, with a man whose death she was not going to stop being angry about. "Tell me about your lodge," she said. And Gideon Blackthorne, who had driven 40 minutes to a cooking competition for reasons he still wasn't entirely sure of, who had tasted a dead woman's recipe in a fairground tent and felt 20 years of grief knock against him like a wave, began to talk. Martha Whitlock listened the way she did everything, carefully, completely, without missing anything. She had not come 41 miles for a blue ribbon. She had come because a recipe card and a dead husband and a set of unanswered questions had pointed her in a direction, and she was a woman who followed directions when they made sense. And this one was beginning to make more sense than anything had in the 11 months since 2 men from the Halverson Company had knocked on her door and told her Thomas was gone. The fire burned down and they ordered food, and they sat in that corner table in Caldwell Crossing until the dining room was empty around them, talking, building something out of shared grief and incomplete evidence and a stew that tasted like a woman who had been missing for 20 years. It was not, Martha thought, the day she had planned on. But then, she had learned in the past year that the days you planned on rarely counted for much. It was the ones you didn't plan that tended to change things. The wagon axle was repaired by morning. Martha had not asked how or by whom. She'd come down to the livery at first light expecting to deal with it herself, and found it already done. The cracked wood replaced with a solid piece of ash, the wheel housing reset and greased. She stood looking at it for a moment, then went back inside and had breakfast. She drove back to Sulphur Creek that morning. The road was easier going east, or maybe the axle was simply doing what an axle was supposed to do for the first time in 2 days, and she made the distance in better time than the trip out. She passed through the familiar stretch of scrub pine and open meadow that marked the last few miles before town, pulled up to the house on Cutler Road, and sat in the wagon for a moment looking at it. It was a good house. Thomas had built most of it himself in the first 3 years of their marriage, adding rooms as the need arose, fixing what broke. After he died, she'd kept it up as well as she could manage, but there was a quality to a house when only one person was living in it that no amount of upkeep could fully address. It looked not neglected exactly, just thin, like it was waiting for something that wasn't coming. She went inside and started on the boxes. There were 9 of them, stacked in the back room where she'd put them after her father's funeral 6 years ago. She'd wrapped each one in burlap against the dust and never unwrapped them. Now she cut the ties with her kitchen knife and went through them methodically, the way she did things. Not rushing, not dreading, just working. Most of it was what she expected. Her father's clothes, folded with the care of a man who owned few things and valued them. His tools, which she'd already sorted through after the funeral and taken what she needed. Letters from her mother before their marriage, which Martha set to one side carefully and did not read. A tin of coins, some of it the old Spanish kind that still circulated in the territory, some of it American silver, that she counted and put in her household money. The 7th box was different. It was smaller than the others, reinforced at the corners with strips of tin, and the latch was a good one. A brass mechanism she hadn't seen before, not the simple clasp of the other boxes. Her father had not mentioned this box. She couldn't remember helping him pack it or carry it. The latch opened without a key. Inside, layered under a folded piece of oilcloth, were papers. Martha sat back on her heels and looked at them without touching them for a moment. Then she lifted the oilcloth carefully and spread the papers on the floor in front of her. There were perhaps 30 pages. Some were loose sheets covered in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Small, precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to recording things accurately. Some were folded documents, official-looking, with letterheads she could make out. Halverson Supply and Transport Company, with an address in Cheyenne. And tucked between two of the folded documents, a letter addressed to no one, written in the same small, precise hand as the loose pages. Martha read the letter first. It was not long. It said, "If you have found this, it means I could not deliver it myself. What is in this box is a record of what the Halverson Company has done to its workers over the period of 14 years. Deaths reported as accidents that were not, safety violations covered with payments to local recorders, supply deliveries recorded in the official ledger that never arrived at the camps. 31 names. I have tried to report this through official channels and been turned away twice. I do not know if this box will reach anyone who can use it. I only know that I cannot carry it any longer and I cannot destroy it. To whoever reads this, the families of these men deserve to know what happened to them. I am entrusting this to a man I believe to be honest. I hope I am right about him. CB." CB Martha read the initials twice. Then she sat on the floor of her back room in the house on Cutler Road and was very still for a long time. Her father had been carrying this for 20 years, had carried it in silence in a locked tin box in a back room because a woman named Clara Blackthorne had trusted him to hold it, and he had held it, and then he had died without telling anyone. Maybe he had told Thomas. Maybe that was why Thomas had been looking at the supply numbers, why he'd noticed the discrepancies, why he'd had a copy of the recipe card in his pocket like something to hold on to. Or maybe Thomas had found the box, had read the papers, had decided to do something about it himself because that was the kind of man he was, the kind of man who thought that noticing something wrong created an obligation to fix it, the kind of man who would end up alone on a mountain path with no witnesses. Martha gathered the papers carefully, the way you handle things that have been waiting a long time to matter, and wrapped them back in the oilcloth and put the box on the table where she could see it. Then she went to her kitchen and made coffee and drank it standing at the window, looking out at the yard, at the fence Thomas had repaired the summer before he died, at the ordinary evidence of an ordinary life that had been more complicated than she'd known. Then she packed a bag, loaded the tin box into the wagon, and drove back toward Timber Pass. Gideon's mountain lodge sat on a south-facing slope at 3,800 feet, backed against a ridge of ponderosa pine with a view down the valley that, on clear days, stretched 20 miles. It was a substantial operation. The main lodge building was 2 stories of hewn timber with a long covered porch, flanked by a cookhouse and 3 outbuildings, with a barn and horse pens below the main structure. There was a garden, dormant now in October, and a root cellar, and a well with a good mechanism, the kind of place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. Martha pulled up to the main lodge in the late afternoon, the light already going amber and cold. Gideon came out onto the porch before she'd set the brake, which told her he'd been watching for her, or had someone watching. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." He looked at the wagon bed, at the tin box sitting in the back alongside her bag. His eyes stayed on the box for a moment longer than was casual. "Come inside," he said. The lodge was warm and smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, and the particular smell of a place that had been lived in and worked for a long time. There was a long table in the main room that could seat 16, and a fireplace large enough to stand in, and shelves of practical books along one wall alongside more practical things: rope, tools, ammunition in labeled tins. A working man's interior, nothing decorative for the sake of decoration. A woman named Edna Foss was the lodge's housekeeper, a compact woman in her 60s with efficient movements and the expression of someone who had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. She nodded at Martha, showed her to a room on the second floor that was small and clean and had a window facing east, and left without asking unnecessary questions. Martha appreciated this. She brought the tin box down when she came back to the main room, and she set it on Gideon's table, and she opened the latch, and she told him what she'd found. She watched his face while she spoke. She had become in the past year a student of what people's faces did when they heard things that mattered, the specific ways grief and anger and shock moved through a person's expression. Gideon Blackthorne's face did something she hadn't expected. It didn't collapse. It didn't go hard with anger. It went, very briefly, to something that looked almost like relief. The particular expression of a man who has been told that a thing he knew was real is, in fact, real. She found it, he said when Martha finished. She actually found the records. Your mother had 31 names documented, Martha said. Deaths, dates, circumstances, supply deliveries that were billed but never arrived at the camps. She had the company letterhead, which means she had access to the official documents. She would have needed to be inside the operation to get those. She was inside it for 8 months before she disappeared, Gideon said. He reached out and touched the edge of one of the folded documents, not picking it up, just acknowledging it. She was the kind of woman who would have known immediately that something was wrong. She had a gift for numbers, for patterns. She would have seen the discrepancies in the first week. He paused. That means she spent 7 months building the record before she made any move to report it. She was careful, Martha said. She was careful, he agreed, and she was right to be. And it still wasn't enough. They sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, the specific unfairness of a careful person who did everything right and still lost. It's enough now, Martha said, or it can be if we handle it correctly. Gideon looked at her across the table. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that documents are only useful if they reach the right people. A territorial court, a federal inspector. Someone with the authority to compel an investigation. Just having the records isn't enough. Halverson's people have had 20 years to build relationships with local officials, to pay the right men, to make sure that anything coming through local channels gets buried. So we need to come at them from a direction they're not watching, Gideon said. You said men come through this lodge. Railroad executives, contractors. She looked around the room, at the long table, at the shelves. Who are they? Gideon was quiet for a moment. The territorial railroad expansion brings a certain kind of man to this part of Wyoming. Men with money and connections, men doing business with every major supply operation in the region. Halverson's outfit isn't the only one they work with, but it's one of the significant ones. He paused. They come here because it's comfortable and private. They talk because they feel safe. Then I need to be in that kitchen, Martha said, and I need to be invisible. She said it plainly, without resentment. It was simply an operational fact. A middle-aged woman who cooked and served and cleaned and kept her eyes down was precisely the kind of person that men in good coats said things in front of, because they had already decided she didn't matter. She had spent enough of her life being that woman to know exactly how much you could hear from that position if you were paying attention. I'm not going to ask you to, Gideon started. You're not asking, I'm offering. She looked at him steadily. My husband is dead because of these men. Your mother is dead because of these men. You've spent 12 years not being able to do anything about it because you've been coming at it the wrong way. I'm offering you a different way. She paused. I can cook. I'm good at it, as you may have noticed, and I am, as you pointed out yesterday, someone people overlook. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression of reassessment she was beginning to recognize. The current cook, Warren, he leaves in 10 days, Gideon said. That's fine. There's a party coming through in 3 weeks. Railroad men and 2 senior officers of the Halverson Company. He said it carefully, watching her face. Elias Corbin. He's the regional operations director. The other is a man named Stuart Price who handles their legal arrangements. Martha filed the names. Then I'd better learn your kitchen before they arrive, she said. She learned it in 8 days. Warren, the departing cook, was a lean and slightly melancholy man from Ohio who had cooked at the lodge for 4 years and had mixed feelings about leaving. He showed Martha the root cellar and the dry stores and the particular temperament of the wood-burning range, which ran hot on the left side and needed careful management. He showed her Gideon's preferences and the preferences of the regular ranch hands, 12 men in season, 8 in winter, and the standards expected when the lodge had guests. He was thorough about it, more thorough than she'd expected. And she realized after a day of working with him that he was thorough because he cared about the work, not because he was making sure she'd struggle without him. You're good, he told her on the 4th day, watching her break down a shoulder of elk for a braise. You've got the instincts. The range will give you trouble until you learn to read it. I've handled difficult ranges before, Martha said. I don't doubt it. He paused. Gideon's a fair employer, quiet, but fair. He doesn't explain himself much, but he doesn't need to. You learn to read what he means. A pause. Something's different about this arrangement. He's not, I don't know, sitting differently. Martha kept her attention on the meat. People sit differently when things change. I suppose they do, Warren said, and didn't press it. She was also, in those 8 days, going through the documents from the tin box with Gideon in the evenings after the ranch hands had eaten and the lodge was quiet. They spread the papers on the long table in the main room and went through them systematically, his mother's handwriting growing more familiar with each page, the precise, careful record of a woman documenting something she knew was dangerous. The picture that emerged was methodical and ugly. The Halverson Company had been running a supply operation for mining and logging camps across the Wyoming Territory for over 20 years. The camps paid for supplies, food, medicine, equipment, at full invoice price. The supplies that actually arrived at the camps were consistently below the invoice quantity, short on medicine, short on quality food, short on safety equipment. The difference was profit. Workers in underfed, under-equipped camps got sick, got hurt, died at rates that were higher than industry average, but not so dramatically higher that it attracted immediate scrutiny, especially when local officials were receiving regular payments to keep their scrutiny elsewhere. 31 specific deaths. Clara Blackthorne had documented each one, name, camp, official cause of death, and then beside it, her own notes. Not consistent with accident, see supply invoice discrepancy, medical kit listed but never delivered, safety equipment requisitioned but not shipped. She was thorough, Martha said one evening, looking at a page covered in Clara's handwriting. She was, Gideon said. He was sitting across the table from her, and for a moment he just looked at his mother's writing. She was the most organized person I have ever known. She kept the household accounts like a professional bookkeeper. Everything in order, everything accurate. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. I used to complain about it when I was a boy. I thought it was excessive. I thought she spent too much time on paperwork. She was building a skill, Martha said. Yes. He picked up one of the pages, held it. She was 42 when she disappeared, about your age. He said it without particular implication. Martha heard it as a statement of fact. She knew what she was doing when she gave those papers to my father, Martha said. She knew it was dangerous. She handed over the one thing that could prove what she'd found, and she trusted it to someone she barely knew, which means she thought she was out of other options. Or she thought she was about to be stopped. Or that. They looked at each other across the spread of her papers, and Martha thought about a 42-year-old woman making a decision in what must have been a moment of real fear, handing a locked box to a traveling laborer named Richard Hale, and hoping, with what must have been a very specific kind of hope, that it would eventually reach somewhere that mattered. It had taken 20 years, but it had reached somewhere. The 3 weeks before the railroad party's arrival settled into a rhythm. Martha cooked 3 meals a day for Gideon and the ranch hands, managed the stores, and in the evening sat with Gideon going through documents or talking about what they needed. The ranch hands were a varied group, some long-tenured, some seasonal, all of them practically minded men who were polite to Martha in the straightforward way of men who respected competence. One of them, a young hand named Corbett, had taken to appearing in the kitchen at odd hours with the transparent excuse of needing water, and Martha understood that he was lonely and bored and had decided she was interesting. She put him to work chopping vegetables, and he turned out to be useful, which solved the problem of his lingering. She also, in those 3 weeks, began to understand Gideon Blackthorne more clearly. He was not an easy man. He was quiet in the way of someone who had chosen silence as a strategy at some point, and then found it had become a habit too ingrained to easily break. He had opinions he didn't share readily. He made decisions without explaining them, and then was mildly surprised when people wanted explanations. He had run this lodge for 20 years largely through force of consistent will, and had the slightly solitary quality that came from living long in a landscape where the nearest neighbor was several miles away. He also, she noticed, felt things more deeply than he showed. She saw it in small moments, in the way he paused sometimes when he thought no one was watching, in the way he sometimes picked up one of his mother's document pages and just held it for a moment before setting it down again, in the way he looked at the mountain through the lodge window with an expression that had nothing to do with ranching. He was grieving, had been grieving for 20 years, had organized his entire life around a grief that had nowhere to go because the truth of it had been buried. She understood this better than she wanted to. "You built this place after she disappeared?" she asked him one evening. He looked up from his papers. I was 24. The family had the land, my father's original claim. After my mother, after everything, I didn't know what else to do. So I built. He looked around the room. It took 3 years to build the main structure. I had help from 2 ranch hands who stayed through the whole thing. We worked through 2 winters. He paused. I thought if I built something permanent, it would feel permanent, like I had a place to stand from. Did it work? He considered this honestly. Partway, he said. It gave me something to stand in. Whether I actually stood anywhere is a different question. Martha thought about the house on Cutler Road, about the rooms Thomas had built and she'd maintained, about the fence post he'd fixed the summer before he died, the way a place could hold the shape of someone who was gone until the shape was almost unbearable. I understand that, she said. He looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the fire made its sounds and the October wind moved through the pines outside, and Martha thought that understanding something and being comforted by it were not the same thing, and that this was a distinction that mattered. The railroad party arrived on a Tuesday, 3 wagons coming up the mountain road in the early afternoon. 8 men altogether, 4 railroad executives, the 2 Halverson men Gideon had named, and 2 others whose affiliation Martha noted but didn't immediately place. She watched them arrive from the cookhouse window, her hands in bread dough, memorizing faces against the names Gideon had given her. Elias Corbin was heavier than she'd imagined, with a well-fed authority about him and the particular ease of a man who had spent decades being deferred to. Stuart Price was thinner, careful-looking, with watchful eyes that scanned a room the way a lawyer's eyes do, evaluating, categorizing, deciding what was safe to say. The dinner that first evening was a roast elk with preserved summer vegetables and fresh bread, followed by an apple tart that used the last of the lodge's dried apple stores. Martha served it herself, as agreed, just the widow cook from Sulphur Creek, efficient and quiet. She refilled glasses and cleared plates and moved between the kitchen and the dining room with practiced invisibility. And she listened. Most of the dinner conversation was operational. Railroad routes, land surveys, cost disputes between contractors. The kind of business talk that meant nothing to her, and she suspected meant little even to the men speaking it, the performance of business at a dinner table. But after the tart came out, and someone produced whiskey and the lamps went lower as they always did when men settled in, for the real part of an evening, she heard Corbin say something that stopped her hand on the ladle. The Greystone Camp situation, he said, needs to not exist in any paperwork by end of month. Price said something in response, too low for her to hear from the kitchen doorway, and Corbin said, I don't care how it's handled, Stuart. It's not my concern how. Martha noted it, carefully and completely, and went back to the kitchen and did not show it on her face. She noted 8 other things before the evening was over. When she came upstairs that night and knocked once on Gideon's door, he opened it before the knock was finished. He'd been awake, waiting. Well, he said. I need paper, she said. I need to write down everything I heard before I sleep on it. He got paper. She sat at the small desk in her room and wrote for an hour, her handwriting as precise as she could make it, thinking of Clara Blackthorne's careful pages downstairs in the tin box. When she was done, she read it back and saw the shape of something. Not the whole picture, not yet, but the corners of it, the edges. The beginning of something that could be built into something else, given time and careful attention. She folded the pages and put them with the tin box under her floorboard. Then she lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about 31 names, and about a woman who had trusted her father with something too heavy to carry alone, and about the fact that she had been carrying various versions of that weight herself for the better part of a year, and that she was, for the first time since Thomas died, not carrying it entirely alone. It was not comfort exactly, but it was something different from before. She slept. The railroad party stayed 4 days. Martha cooked every meal and said almost nothing and heard a great deal. By the time the 3 wagons went back down the mountain road on Friday morning, she had filled 11 pages in her precise handwriting and had a clearer picture of how the Halverson Company's operation actually worked than she'd had in 11 months of quiet investigation from Sulphur Creek. It was worse than the documents in the tin box suggested. Not in volume. Clara Blackthorne's records were thorough, but in how current it was. The supply fraud hadn't slowed or changed or evolved into something less lethal. It was ongoing. The Greystone camp Corbin had mentioned was a logging operation 60 miles north, active right now, and the medicine listed in their last supply invoice had not been delivered in full. She'd heard Price confirm it in an indirect way that a lawyer would use, telling Corbin that the Greystone adjustment had been processed consistent with prior arrangements. She'd been standing 4 feet away refilling a water pitcher. She told Gideon all of it the afternoon the party left, sitting at the long table with her 11 pages between them. He read through everything twice without speaking. When he looked up, his jaw was set in a way she'd come to recognize. Not anger exactly, or not only anger. The particular expression of a man confronted with evidence that the thing he already knew was true is, in fact, true, and that knowing it and being able to do something about it were still not the same thing. Greystone, he said. Active operation. Current deliveries. Martha tapped the relevant page. If there are workers sick in that camp right now because of a medicine shortage that Halverson billed them for and didn't deliver, that's not a historical crime. That's a present one. It changes the timeline, Gideon said. It changes everything about the approach. She leaned forward. We've been thinking about this as a matter of exposing the past, your mother's records, Thomas's suspicions, the 31 names, all of it true and important. But Halverson's lawyers will argue that it's old evidence from a dead woman who can't testify. They'll find procedural problems. They'll buy time. She paused. But if there's a live situation at Greystone, if we can document that the current deliveries are short, that workers are being harmed right now, that's a different legal problem. That's harder to bury. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this more than I have. I've had less to lose by thinking clearly, she said. It wasn't cruel. Just accurate. You've been inside this for 20 years. That's a long time to carry something. It's harder to think straight when it's that personal. He didn't disagree, which she respected. We need someone at Greystone, he said. Someone who can document what's actually being delivered versus what's invoiced. Do you have men you trust? Someone who could go north without it looking like anything? Corbett, Gideon said after a moment. He's young, but he sighs solid. He's been with me 2 years and he keeps his mouth shut. He paused. He's also been spending half his free time in your kitchen, so he's clearly capable of sustained commitment to a cause. Martha almost smiled. He's useful with vegetables, she said. That's rarer than it sounds. That evening she explained the task to Corbett in the kitchen while he was doing exactly what Gideon had described, appearing with the transparent excuse of needing water. He listened without interrupting, which was the first indicator that he was smarter than he sometimes appeared. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands. You want me to count boxes? He said. I want you to count boxes and write down what you count, with dates, nothing dramatic. You're a traveler looking for seasonal work. Logging camps always need hands in November. You go in, you work, you keep your eyes open, and you come back with numbers. And if someone figures out what I'm doing, don't let them figure out what you're doing, Martha said. Act like a man who is thinking about nothing more complicated than wages and supper, which, judging from your behavior in this kitchen, should not be difficult. Corbett looked at her, and then he grinned. A young man's sudden grin that changed his whole face. You're not what I expected, he said. Nobody ever is, Martha told him. Leave Wednesday. Come back in 2 weeks. November settled over the mountain with the particular severity of high Wyoming. Not the dramatic violence of a blizzard, but the steady grinding cold that came in and stayed, that made every task slightly harder and every mistake slightly more costly. Martha learned the lodge's winter rhythms, the way the water pipes needed attention before hard frost, the way the main fireplace drew differently when the wind came from the north, the way Gideon got up before 4 in the morning when the temperature dropped past a certain point to check on the livestock himself rather than wait for the hands. She also continued building the case. Not all of it came from dramatic moments of overheard conversation. Most of it was slower than that, a pattern assembled from small things. The supply invoices that Gideon had accumulated over years of doing business in the territory, which in isolation meant nothing but read alongside Clara's records, revealed a consistent system. A man named Dunmore, who came through the lodge in late November carrying correspondence for one of the railroad executives, and who, over a dinner she'd been careful to make exceptional, talked about his 10 years working supply routes and said things he likely forgot by morning that she wrote down that night word for word. And there was the question of who else knew. Claire's documents named the deaths and documented the supply fraud, but they didn't name the internal chain. Who inside Halverson knew what? Who had given what orders? Who had signed off on the decisions that killed 31 men? Martha had Corbin and Price from her own observation. She had some names from Dunmore's conversation, but there was a gap at the top. The company's owner, a man named Douglas Halverson, who operated from Cheyenne and who Martha had never seen and couldn't place directly in the chain of decisions. He has to know, she told Gideon one evening. The documents spread between them as they'd become usual. An operation this systematic, running for 20 years. You cannot tell me the owner didn't know. I've never been able to connect him directly, Gideon said. Corbin runs the Wyoming operations. Halverson stays in Cheyenne and keeps distance between himself and the day-to-day. That's intentional distance, Martha said. That's a man who understood the exposure and arranged himself to be deniable. She picked up one of Claire's pages. Your mother documented the Cheyenne end as well, some of it. She had an invoice signed from the main office, not Corbin's signature, someone above him. She found the page she wanted and set it in front of him. This signature. Gideon looked at it. Something moved in his face. She never told me she had documentation going that high. She may not have known what she had, or she was still piecing it together when Martha stopped. When she ran out of time. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the wind was doing something serious to the pines. I want to find the right venue, Martha said after a moment. The right moment. We have the documents, your mother's records, what I've gathered, what Corbett will bring back from Greystone. But documents on their own. Go to the wrong official and disappear, Gideon said. He'd clearly thought about this longer than she had. So we need it to happen publicly, in front of too many people to suppress. She looked at him. You told me these men come through the lodge. The railroad executives, the contractors. Is there an occasion, a gathering that's already planned, where the Halverson principals would be present alongside men who are not invested in protecting them? Gideon was quiet for a long moment. There's a year-end banquet, he said slowly. It's a territorial tradition, goes back 15 years, hosted at different locations. This year it was designated for the lodge. He paused. I agreed to host it before I knew... He stopped. Before you came into this. Who attends? Railroad executives. Territorial business owners. 3 federal land agents who come up from Denver every year. They're the ones who handle the land surveys for the railroad expansion. He looked at her. Douglas Halverson has attended the past 4 years. Corbin always comes. Price. Martha thought about this carefully. When? She said. December 14th. 3 weeks. She looked at the spread of documents on the table and did the arithmetic in her head. What they had, what they still needed, what Corbett might bring back from Greystone, whether it would be enough to do what she was beginning to think needed to be done. The federal land agents, she said. They're legitimate officials? Senior men. One of them, a man named Aldrich, has a reputation for being difficult to buy. He's audited 2 operations in the past decade, and both times it led to actual consequences. Gideon paused. He's also, I should mention, someone I know, not well, but enough. Then we need him to come to that banquet understanding more than he usually does, Martha said. You're thinking about contacting him beforehand. I'm thinking about making sure that when things unfold in that room, there is at least one person present who has the authority to act on what he sees and the character to use it. She met Gideon's eyes. Everything else needs to happen in the room, in front of everyone. In front of too many witnesses to be quietly managed. He looked at her steadily. You're describing something that can't be undone once it starts. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I'm describing. Corbett came back from Greystone on the 8th of December, 6 days before the banquet, with dirty boots and chapped hands and 4 pages of notes that he'd kept tucked inside his boot the entire time. Martha read them at the kitchen table while he ate the first proper meal he'd had in 2 weeks. The numbers were exactly what she'd feared and exactly what she needed. The medicine delivery for October, the one Price had called the Greystone adjustment, was short by more than half. The food stores invoiced in September were short on protein by a significant margin. 2 men in the camp had been sick with respiratory illness since early November, and the camp's medicine kit didn't have what it should have had to treat them properly. Corbett had written it all down in his careful, unpracticed handwriting, dates and quantities, and one man's name, a worker named Harold Vess, who told Corbett flat out that the company had been promising a full medicine delivery for 6 weeks, and it kept not arriving. "Is Harold Vess still in the camp?" Martha asked. "Far as I know," Corbett said, around a mouthful of bread. "He's not going anywhere. Sick enough that travel is hard." Would he talk to someone official? A federal agent? Corbett thought about it. "He's angry enough to. Whether he'd be scared enough not to is the question." He paused. "He lost a friend 2 years ago. Different camp, same company, thought it was bad luck at the time. After talking to me some, I didn't say anything specific, just listened. He started wondering otherwise." Martha set the pages down and looked at them. Harold Vess. A living witness with a current grievance and a past loss and an address she now knew. This was different from documents. Documents could be argued with, questioned, attributed to a dead woman's bias. A man who was alive and sick and angry was harder to dismiss. She added his name and the Greystone details to the master set of documents and put everything back under the floorboard and spent the rest of the day thinking about how a banquet dinner was actually structured when you were the person cooking it. The answer she knew was that the cook controlled the timing. The cook decided when courses arrived, how long people sat between them, when the meal was done, and the table became a place for the kind of talking that happened after eating. And timing, in this particular situation, was not incidental. It was everything. She wrote to Aldrich 4 days before the banquet. Not the full story, not the documents, but enough. A letter that told a federal land agent that the year-end banquet he'd been invited to would contain information relevant to his professional responsibilities, and that he should come prepared to act in an official capacity if the situation warranted it. She kept it precise and sober, and she signed her full name, Martha Whitlock, because an anonymous letter could be dismissed, but a signed one carried the weight of someone willing to stand behind it. Gideon read it before she sent it. He didn't suggest changes, which she took as agreement. "If this doesn't work," he said, "we've shown our hand completely." "If this doesn't work," Martha said, "we do the same thing differently, somewhere else, until it does work." "But I don't think it won't work." She paused. These men have been protected for 20 years by the fact that no one ever confronted them with everything at once, in a room they couldn't control, in front of people whose opinion they cared about. She looked at him. Halverson's people are not at their core courageous men. They're men who did terrible things because it was easy and profitable and there were no consequences. Take away the absence of consequences and see what you get. She sent the letter with a writer who was paid well and told to be quick. The 14th of December arrived cold and clear, a hard sky Wyoming winter day with snow on the ridgeline and the valley frozen solid below. Guests began arriving at midday, the railroad men first, then the land agents, then the contractors, and finally, mid-afternoon, 2 wagons from Cheyenne carrying Douglas Halverson and his party. Martha had been in the kitchen since 5 in the morning. She'd planned the menu deliberately, not to impress, though the food would be good, but to structure the evening in a particular way. A long first course that would settle people, make them comfortable, lower their guard in the way good food and warmth and the social ease of familiar company did. A main course substantial enough to occupy them. And then a pause before the final course, a natural break in the evening when people would refill glasses and push back their chairs and begin the real conversation, which in a gathering of this kind was always the conversation about business and money and the territory's future. That was the moment she'd identified. That was when she intended to be in the room rather than the kitchen. Through the afternoon, she moved between the 2 spaces, carrying dishes and reading faces. Douglas Halverson was in his late 60s, a large man gone soft in the way of men who had once been physically imposing and had let it go to weight, with white hair and the ruddy, expensive face of a man who lived well. He shook hands confidently and laughed at appropriate moments, and had the ease of someone who felt entirely safe in this room, in this gathering, in this territory. She watched him shake Gideon's hand. Gideon received it without expression, which was itself a kind of remarkable performance. She knew what it cost him to shake that hand and show nothing. Aldrich arrived at 4 in the afternoon, later than the others. He was a lean, gray man in his 50s with the unhurried manner of someone who was never quite where you expected him to be when you expected him. He found Gideon briefly, said something quiet to him, and Gideon nodded once. Then Aldrich sat at the end of the long table and ate the first course, and watched the room with the attentive patience of a man who had been warned to pay attention. Dinner went as she had planned it. The food was good. She'd made sure of that, not out of vanity, but because bad food made people impatient, and impatient people were harder to read. The room settled into its rhythms. The railroad men talked routes and surveys. Haverson held court at his end of the table with the comfortable authority of a man among men who needed something from him. Corbin ate steadily and said little. Price watched the room the way he always did, that lawyer's watchfulness. When Martha cleared the main course and the table went to the gap between supper and dessert, she stayed. She didn't make a speech. She didn't announce herself or call for attention. She simply set a stack of documents on the table where Halverson could see them, and she looked at the room, and she said, in the clear, even voice she used for things that needed to be said plainly, "Before the tart comes out, there are some records I'd like everyone here to see." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something is shifted without anyone being able to say exactly how. Halverson looked at the documents, then at her, with an expression that was still in the territory of dismissal. "Who is this woman, and what is she doing at my table?" And he said, "I'm sorry, and you are—" "Martha Whitlock," she said. "My husband Thomas worked your supply route for 8 months and died on one of your mountain paths. Before that, a woman named Clara Blackthorne worked your accounts office and disappeared after finding what I'm about to show everyone in this room." The silence deepened. Corbin had gone very still. Price's eyes were moving rapidly between Martha, the documents, Aldrich at the end of the table, and the door, the instinctive calculation of a man assessing exits. She set the first document in front of Halverson, then one in front of Corbin, then one in the middle of the table where the railroad men and federal agents could reach for it. "These are your own invoices," she said, "and these," she laid Clara's pages alongside them, "are the delivery records kept by Clara Blackthorne against those invoices. The discrepancies go back 14 years. The records also name 31 workers who died in conditions your company created and then falsified the documentation to cover." She paused. "And these," Corbett's notes, laid flat, "are the current shortages at the Greystone camp, dated this past month." "This is absurd," Halverson said, but his voice had changed. The comfortable authority was still there by force of habit, but something underneath it had moved. "These documents are fabricated by—" "They're in your letterhead," one of the railroad men said, quietly, from the middle of the table. He was looking at the invoice in front of him with the careful expression of a man who understood supply accounting and was reading what was in front of him. "This is your company's letterhead. And this signature," said another man, pointing, "I've seen this signature on documents from your Cheyenne office before." Halverson turned to Price. Price said nothing. He was looking at the documents on the table, and his face had the expression of a man doing the legal calculation in his head and arriving at a conclusion he didn't like. "Mr. Halverson." Aldrich's voice came from the end of the table, quiet and official, and carrying the particular weight of a man who did not need to raise it. "I'm going to ask you to remain seated. I'm going to ask everyone in this room to remain seated." He reached into his coat and produced a small leather identification holder, which he opened and set on the table in front of him. "I received a communication several days ago that led me to come to this gathering in an official capacity. Given what I am currently looking at, I believe that capacity is now active." "You have no authority to—" Corbin started. "I have federal land agency authority over every supply contract connected to railroad expansion in this territory," Aldrich said, still quietly, "which includes every operation this company runs. So yes, Mr. Corbin, I do." The room sat with that. Halverson looked at the documents again. He looked at Gideon, who had been standing near the fireplace in silence, and something passed over his face. Recognition, Martha thought. Perhaps a long-delayed recognition of who this man was and what this gathering actually was. "Your mother," Halverson said. It was not quite a question. "My mother," Gideon said. The silence that followed was a particular kind. The silence of a room where something that has been hidden for a long time has just come into the light, and everyone present understands that the hiding is over, and no one has yet fully reckoned with what that means. Halverson's lawyer, not Price, a third man Martha hadn't identified, who'd been quiet through dinner, put his hand on Halverson's arm and leaned toward him. Halverson shook him off. "She found the ledger discrepancies," Halverson said. His voice had changed again, gone to something flatter. "She was going to take them to the federal office in Denver. We couldn't—" He stopped. "Couldn't what?" Gideon said. The fire burned. Everyone in the room was watching Halverson, and Halverson was looking at the documents. And the decades of distance he'd built between himself and the decisions he'd made were collapsing in the particular way of things built on the assumption that they would never be examined. "She knew too much," Halverson said, and the lawyer grabbed his arm again, hard this time, and Halverson stopped. But he'd said enough. Aldrich had produced a small notebook and was writing in it. The two other federal agents who'd come with him, Martha hadn't known there were two others, Gideon must have arranged it, came through the lodge door from outside, where they'd apparently been waiting, and the room understood that the evening had become something that none of them, except perhaps Martha and Gideon and Aldrich, had anticipated when they'd driven up the mountain road to a year-end banquet at a lodge in the Wyoming highlands. Corbin looked at Price. Price looked at the ceiling. One of the railroad men pushed his chair back slightly, the instinctive distancing of a man who wanted to establish that he had not known, had not been part of this, had arrived tonight with no more intention than supper and business conversation. Martha stood at the end of the long table in the lodge that Gideon Blackthorne had built, with his hands over 3 hard winters, and she looked at the documents spread across the white tablecloth, and she thought about Thomas in a mountain path with nobody watching, and about a 42-year-old woman handing a locked box to a traveling laborer and hoping the truth would eventually find its way to a room like this one. It had found its way. It had taken 20 years and 41 miles on a broken axle, and 11 months of quiet fury, and a recipe card that tasted like a dead woman's memory, but it had found its way. She turned to the kitchen to get the apple tart, because the tart was ready and people would need something to do while the federal agents began the work of the evening, and because she was, after everything, still the cook. The apple tart sat untouched on the sideboard for the better part of an hour. Nobody ate it. Nobody left the table either, which was partly because Aldrich's 2 colleagues had positioned themselves near the lodge door with a quiet purposefulness that made departure feel inadvisable, and partly because the room had entered a particular state of suspended motion, the kind that follows a catastrophic shift in a situation's gravity, when everyone present is still calculating what it means for them personally and hasn't yet resolved that calculation into action. Martha set the tart on the sideboard, noted that no one was looking at it, and stood near the kitchen doorway. She was not going to disappear into the kitchen now. She had earned the right to stand in this room, and she intended to use it. Aldrich worked methodically. He was the kind of official who understood that the first hour of a situation like this was the most important, that the window between initial shock and the moment when lawyers and composure and practiced denial reasserted themselves was narrow, and that what got said in that window had a different quality than anything said after it closed. He went around the table with the unhurried efficiency of a man who'd done this before, not threatening, not dramatic, just asking questions and writing down answers, and letting the silence after each answer do its own work. He started with the railroad men. They were not strictly speaking culpable, or at least not in any way that Martha had documented. They were men who had done business with Halverson's company, who had signed contracts and processed invoices and asked no questions about what happened in the supply camps, because asking questions was not in their immediate financial interest. Aldrich appeared to understand the distinction. He took their statements briefly and moved on, and the relief visible on several faces was genuine, if not particularly dignified. Corbin was different. Corbin was the operations director. Corbin's name appeared in Clara's records, in Martha's notes from the first railroad party, in the Greystone documentation. When Aldrich reached him, Corbin's composure had the quality of something being held together by sustained muscular effort. Visible work, visible strain. "Mr. Corbin," Aldrich said, "I'd like to discuss the supply delivery records for the period covered by these documents, specifically the discrepancies between the invoiced quantities and the documented deliveries. I'd like to speak with counsel before answering any—" "You're entitled to that," Aldrich said agreeably. "In the meantime, I'd ask you to remain at the table." He moved on to Price with the same unhurried manner, and Price, who had been silent for the past 40 minutes, said the same thing about counsel, in a voice stripped of its usual precision. A man reciting a line he'd always known he might need. Halverson had not spoken since his lawyer had grabbed his arm. He sat at the head of the table with the documents in front of him, and he looked at them occasionally with an expression that Martha could only describe as the look of a man confronting something he had long ago decided he would never have to confront. Not guilt, exactly. She didn't think it was guilt, or not primarily. It was the expression of a man whose arrangement with the world had been very suddenly and completely canceled, and who was only now beginning to understand the full extent of what that meant. His lawyer, she'd caught the name by now, Hendricks, leaned toward him repeatedly and was repeatedly ignored. After the third attempt, Halverson turned and looked at Hendricks with something in his eyes that stopped the lawyer cold. "Douglas," Hendricks said quietly, "do not say anything else." "I already said enough," Halverson said. He looked at Gideon. He'd been looking at Gideon, Martha realized, in the way of a man who cannot stop looking at the thing he most wants to look away from. Gideon stood near the fireplace and looked back. He didn't speak. He had said almost nothing since the word mother had passed between them, and Martha thought she understood why. That he had 20 years of things to say to Douglas Halverson, and none of them could be said in this room, in front of these people, without costing him something he wasn't willing to spend. So he stood and he looked, and Halverson looked back, and whatever passed between them in that exchange was not something Martha tried to name. The formal proceedings began the following morning. Aldrich had sent a rider to the territorial capital before midnight, a fast man on a fast horse with a sealed document explaining the situation and requesting support. By the following afternoon, 2 additional federal officials arrived at the lodge, along with a territorial marshal named Dokes, who Martha had not met before, but who had the specific quality of a man doing a job he'd done many times and intended to do correctly. The lodge became, for the next 3 days, something between a courthouse and a holding facility. Halverson and Corbin were formally detained, but not in cells, there were none, but confined to their rooms with a marshal outside each door and their movements restricted. Price, exercising his legal prerogatives, was allowed to move more freely, but was required to remain at the lodge pending further proceedings. The railroad men gave their formal statements and were released to travel, most of them moving with the urgency of people very eager to be somewhere else. Martha cooked for all of them. It was, she thought, the strangest circumstance under which she'd ever fed people. A lodge full of federal officials and detained men, and the marshal and his deputies, all of them eating her food at the long table where the night before the world had shifted on its axis. She fed them because people needed to eat, and she was the cook, and those facts remained constant regardless of what else was happening, and also because keeping her hands busy while she thought was a habit she'd had since childhood and was not inclined to break. Gideon was interviewed by Aldrich on the second day for nearly 3 hours. Martha saw him come out of the room they'd used as a formal interview space, Gideon's own study, which struck her as an additional indignity, though Gideon didn't seem to register it, and she thought he looked like a man who had just lifted something very heavy and set it down and was still not entirely sure what to do with his arms now that they were empty. She brought him coffee. He took it without speaking and stood at the window looking out at the mountain, and she stood near him and didn't try to fill the silence. After a while he said, he confirmed it. Under questioning, he confirmed that she'd been that men were sent to make sure she didn't reach the federal office in Denver. Martha had known this. Had known it since the banquet, since Halverson's face and his partial sentence and the look in his eyes when Gideon had said, "my mother." But knowing something and hearing it confirmed in plain words were different things, and she watched Gideon's face as he said it and understood that for him this confirmation was both necessary and terrible. The closing of a wound that had been open so long it had become structural, had become part of how he organized himself, and closing it would require a kind of relearning. She knew she was in danger, Martha said quietly. That's why she gave the documents to my father. She knew they were coming. Aldrich said she likely had hours between understanding what was going to happen and when it happened. Gideon's voice was flat. She used those hours to make sure the records survived. He paused. That's who she was. Even then, even knowing, she was thinking about the records. Martha said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say, and she was wise enough to know it. She was 42, Gideon said, more quietly. Yes. I've been 46 for 3 months. I'm older than she ever got to be. He turned from the window and looked at Martha with the direct look he used when he was going to say something he'd decided was worth saying. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, Martha said. Right now you just have to drink the coffee and let the federal men do their work. He looked at the cup. It's cold. I'll make fresh, she said, and took it back to the kitchen. And while the water heated, she stood at the cookhouse window and looked at the mountain herself for a moment, at the pine-covered ridge white with the weak snow, at the clear winter sky above it, and she thought about Thomas's copy of the recipe card in his pocket, when they brought him down from the mountain path, and she thought that the hardest part of justice was that it came too late to give back what had been taken. It came anyway. That was the only answer she had to that, and she knew it was insufficient, and she made fresh coffee. The investigation expanded faster than Martha had expected. By the end of the first week, Aldrich's office had sent men to the Greystone camp with the delivery records Corbett had assembled. Harold Vess, who was still there and still sick and considerably more angry than when Corbett had spoken to him, gave a formal statement that corroborated the supply shortages precisely. 2 other workers at Greystone did the same. The camp supervisor, a man named Briggs, who had been sending complaints to the Halverson regional office for months and receiving non-responses, turned over his own correspondence record, which added a new dimension to the documentation. A paper trail of a man reporting problems to an employer who systematically ignored them. Word spread the way. Word spreads in a territory where distance is measured in days of travel, slowly at first, and then all at once. By the middle of December, 3 other supply camps had sent representatives to Aldrich's office. By Christmas, the territorial paper in the capital had the story. By the new year, a larger paper out of Denver had picked it up, and the particular quality of the coverage had changed. It was no longer a regional matter between a supply company and its workers. It had become the kind of story that required a reckoning. Martha read the Denver paper at the lodge table one morning in January. Gideon was across from her with his own reading, and she set the paper down after a while and looked at it. They got the 31 names right, she said. Gideon looked up. All of them? All of them, in print. She ran her finger across the column of names. Someone did the work. He leaned across and looked at the paper. Aldrich's office sent a statement. Yes, but they also listed the names. Someone decided they mattered enough to print. Gideon looked at the column of names for a long moment. Then he said, My mother would have been... She would have wanted this, the names specifically. She was very clear in her notes that the names mattered, that it wasn't an abstract wrong, that there were specific men with specific families. I know, Martha said. I read her notes. 31, he said. For 20 years, nobody knew except the people who did it and the people who didn't want to look. It was not a question, and she didn't answer it as one. She folded the paper and set it on the table and picked up her coffee. The false death reports were a bureaucratic problem as much as a moral one, which was in some ways the most frustrating part of what followed. 20 years of records. Deaths recorded as accidents by local registrars who had been paid to record them that way. Paper that existed in official files, that had legal standing, that could not simply be corrected by a statement of intent. It required formal proceedings, petitions, in some cases the testimony of surviving family members who had to relive the worst moments of their lives in front of officials in rooms that were too formal and too cold and too far from home. Aldrich was good at this, or at least better than the situation deserved. He had a staff member, a woman named Perkins, whose specific function appeared to be the navigation of bureaucratic processes for exactly this kind of correction, and she moved through the records with a methodical determination that Martha found herself respecting from a distance. Martha got involved because she couldn't not. It started when a letter arrived at the lodge in January, addressed to her by name. She didn't know how the sender had found her, though she suspected Aldrich's office, which had her name from the formal proceedings. The letter was from a woman in a town 60 miles north named Ruth Carver, whose husband had died in a Halverson supply camp 4 years earlier. She'd read about the investigation in the territorial paper. She'd always believed her husband's death wasn't right, that the circumstances didn't fit what she'd been told. She didn't know what to do or who to talk to. She wrote to Martha because Martha was a woman and a widow, and that felt, Ruth Carver wrote with the directness of a person who had thought carefully about how to say something difficult, like someone who might understand. Martha wrote back the same day. A long letter, specific and practical. Here is who to contact. Here is what to bring. Here is what the process requires. She also wrote to Aldrich's office that day, naming Ruth Carver and asking them to expect her. A week later, another letter came, from a man in Bitter Creek whose brother had died in a logging camp, then another from a family in Laramie, then two more in the same week. She answered all of them. Gideon found her at the kitchen table one evening in late January, surrounded by letters and her own written responses, a lamp burning low because she'd been at it for 3 hours and hadn't noticed the light fading. How many? He said. 11 families so far, she said, without looking up from what she was writing. Aldrich says there will be more once the Denver coverage circulates further. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the spread of paper. You're doing this yourself. Someone needs to. She set down her pen and looked at him. These are people who have been carrying something incorrect for years. They were told their husbands and brothers and sons died a certain way, and that was a lie, and they've been living inside that lie without knowing it. They deserve someone to answer when they write. You could let Aldrich's office handle the correspondence. Aldrich's office handles it formally. I'm not a formal institution. She picked up the pen again. Ruth Carver wrote to me because I was a widow, and she thought I might understand. She was right. I do understand. That's worth something she won't get from an official form letter. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is there anything I can do? She looked at him. It was the right question, asked the right way. Not offering to take it over, not suggesting she needed help, just asking plainly if there was a role for him. You could answer the ones from men, she said. Some of these families, there are sons writing about fathers, brothers writing about brothers. They might find it easier to hear from another man. She pushed a small stack of unopened letters across the table. You know what happened in those camps better than most. You know the territory. He sat down across from her and picked up the first letter and opened it. They worked at the kitchen table until midnight, two people writing by lamplight. And it was not romantic and it was not dramatic. It was just work, the plain, unglamorous work of helping people understand what had happened to them, and it needed doing, and they did it. The formal charges against Douglas Halverson were filed in February. Corbin had broken in January, not dramatically, not with any particular moment of conscience, but with the practical calculus of a man who understood that the evidence was sufficient to convict him and that cooperating fully was his only remaining option. His statement implicated Halverson directly in the decision to silence Clara Blackthorne. It named 3 other individuals involved in operations management who had known about the supply fraud and participated in covering it. It described in functional, business-like language a system that had run for 14 years with the knowledge and approval of the company's owner. Price, characteristically, said nothing and let his lawyer do his work. He would spend the next year in procedural negotiations. Martha suspected he would ultimately face consequences less severe than Corbin, which was one of the infuriating realities of how the law worked when one man had more legal resources than another. She noted this and filed it in the category of things she couldn't change and tried not to spend too much energy resenting. Douglas Halverson's hearing was held in Cheyenne in March. Martha and Gideon traveled down together, 2 days by wagon, staying at a boarding house south of the city. The hearing was 3 days long, and Martha sat through all of it, in the third row of a courtroom that smelled of pine oil and wet wool. She watched Halverson's face across those 3 days and looked for something in it. Remorse, she thought, or recognition, or something that indicated that the weight of what he'd done had reached him. She didn't find it exactly. What she found was more complicated. An old man who had spent his life making decisions about people he'd never met and had managed, through the practiced distance of management and profit, and the useful habit of not looking too closely at consequences, to avoid understanding what those decisions actually meant. He wasn't a monster, she thought. He was something harder to name, a man who had been very good at not knowing things he didn't want to know, until the not knowing had accumulated into something monstrous. On the third day, when the formal findings were read, she heard 31 names spoken aloud in official proceedings for the first time. The clerk read them as part of the record, names and dates and the corrected cause of death for each. It took a long time. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. People understanding that the length of the reading was itself significant, that each name was a weight being added to the scale. Beside her, she felt Gideon go very still when the clerk reached a certain point in the list. A name she didn't recognize, someone connected to his mother's investigation whom she hadn't previously known about. He didn't make a sound. She felt the stillness and didn't look at him. When the reading was done and the findings had been formally entered, she looked at her hands in her lap, at the calluses and the short nails and the faint scar on her right thumb from a kitchen knife incident 15 years ago. Thomas's hands had been like that too. Working hands, the hands of people who touched the world directly. She thought about the 31 names, about the families who had letters from her in their homes now, about Ruth Carver, who had written to say that the correction of her husband's death record had made her feel, in a way she couldn't quite explain, like she could set something down. That phrase had stayed with Martha, like I could set something down. She understood it precisely. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the thin March cold with the capital streets busy around them and their wagon waiting, Gideon stood and said nothing for a long time. Martha waited. "It's not enough," he said finally. Not bitterly, just accurately. She doesn't come back. Thomas doesn't come back. 31 men don't come back. Whatever happens to Halverson in that courtroom doesn't reverse any of it. No, Martha agreed. It doesn't. So what does it do? She thought about Ruth Carver setting something down. She thought about the 11 families who had written to her and the others who would write, who would now know the true shape of what had happened to their people. She thought about Harold Vess at Greystone, sick in a camp that now had full medicine delivery because federal agents had been through it twice in 2 months. It means the next 31 don't happen, she said. That's what it does. It doesn't fix the past. It changes the future. Gideon looked at her. That's a harder thing to hold on to than revenge would be, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up her coat from the wagon seat and put it on. I didn't say it was easy. I said it was what it does. He looked at her for another moment, and then he turned and began unhitching the horses for water, and Martha climbed up onto the wagon seat and sat in the cold March air and thought about nothing in particular for a while, just the ordinary relief of not having to think anymore, of having done a thing that needed doing and having it behind her. The drive back north took 2 days, same as the drive down. On the second evening, camped in a hollow out of the wind with a decent fire going and coffee that was too strong but hot, Gideon said, "What are you going to do after this?" She looked at the fire. It was a question she had been not thinking about for a while, in the way you don't think about a question when you're not ready to answer it. I don't know yet, she said. The house in Sulphur Creek is still mine. I could go back. You could, he said. He poured more coffee, didn't look at her. She thought about the house on Cutler Road, the thin quality it had, the fence Thomas had fixed. I find I don't much want to, she said carefully. Gideon said nothing. The lodge needs a cook, Martha said. Permanently, I mean, now that Warren's gone. It does, Gideon said, still not looking at her. And there are 11 families who have written to me. More coming, you said. They need somewhere to... She stopped, thought about it. They need somewhere. Not just correspondence. Somewhere to come to, maybe, when they need to. Somewhere that knows what they've been through. He looked at her now with the careful look he used when he was taking something seriously. The lodge, he said. The lodge is big enough, Martha said. Big enough and quiet enough and far enough from town that people can be there without it being public. She paused. I'm not saying I've worked it out. I'm saying I find I don't want to go back to Sulphur Creek, and there might be something worth building here. Gideon was quiet for a long time. The fire did its work. Somewhere in the dark, a horse shifted and settled. I built the lodge because I needed something to stand in, he said finally. You could help me figure out what to do with it. It was not a declaration, and she didn't receive it as one. It was a practical man making a practical offer to a practical woman, and the fact that it meant more than its surface suggested was something they both understood without needing to say it directly. All right, Martha said. She drank her too strong coffee and looked at the fire and thought that the road back would be easier than the road out, which was generally true of most things, and that easier and easy were not the same word, and that she had learned in the past months to be grateful for the distinction. They drove back to the lodge in the first week of March with the snow still thick on the upper road and the horses working hard on the grade. Martha didn't talk much on that last stretch, and neither did Gideon, which was fine. They had arrived, over the months, at the kind of shared quiet that didn't require explanation or apology. The quiet of two people who had been through something together and understood that not everything needed to be spoken to be real. The lodge looked different when she saw it coming up the mountain road. Or maybe it didn't look different, and she was the one who was different. She'd thought about that distinction before and still couldn't resolve it cleanly. The building was the same hewn timber it had always been, the porch the same, the barn below, the Ponderosa Ridge above. But she looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt about a place in a long time. Not ownership. It wasn't hers in that sense. More like recognition, like arriving somewhere her feet already knew. Edna Foss was on the porch when they came up. She watched them pull in with her customary expression of a woman who had seen everything and was still keeping score. "Court went all right?" she said. "Well enough," Gideon said. "Halverson?" "Findings entered, charges formal." He climbed down from the wagon. "It'll take time to work through." Edna looked at him for a moment, then at Martha, then back at Gideon. "You look like a man who's been carrying a load of lumber and just put it down wrong," she said. "Go inside and eat something. Martha, there are letters." I put them on the kitchen table. There were 7 letters. Martha sat with them that evening after supper and read them one by one at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the sounds of the lodge settling into its night sounds around her. 4 were from families she'd already corresponded with, updates, questions, one from Ruth Carver that was simply a letter, the kind you write when you want to stay in contact with someone who has become, without either party exactly planning it, a person who matters to you. 3 were from families she hadn't heard from before. One of them was from the sister of a man named Joseph Crane, who had died in a Halverson camp 6 years ago, and who had read about the investigation in the Denver paper, and who wrote with the particular careful phrasing of someone who had learned to be precise about suffering because imprecision led to being dismissed. "I do not know if my brother's name is among those being corrected. I do not know how to find out. I am writing because I did not know who else to write to." Martha wrote back that night. She found Joseph Crane's name in Clara's records. It was there, one of the 31. And she wrote to his sister and told her what the correction process required, and gave her Perkins's contact information at Aldrich's office, and told her that her brother's name had been in a careful woman's handwriting for 20 years, that someone had thought he mattered enough to document, and that the documentation had survived. She did not know if this was comfort. She knew it was true. Spring came to the mountain the way it always did at that altitude, reluctantly, in fits and retreats, a week of warmth followed by a week of snow, followed by something that couldn't decide what it was. The pines dripped. The road turned to mud and stayed mud for 6 weeks. The root cellar, which Martha had organized over the winter into something more functional than it had been, proved its worth in March when the supply road was impassable for 11 days, and they fed 14 people from what was on hand. She began talking to Gideon seriously about the idea in April. Not the vague version she'd mentioned by the fire on the road back from Cheyenne. She'd had more time to think, and the thinking had made it more specific, which was the only way ideas were worth anything. She sat across from him at the long table one evening with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and told him what she'd worked out. "There are families who need somewhere to come to," she said. "Not charity. I don't mean a charity house. I mean a place that understands what they've been through and can be useful to them. Some of them are widows with children who are trying to figure out how to manage. Some are injured men who can't work the same way they used to and don't know what's available to them. Some are just people who have been carrying something wrong for years and need somewhere quiet to be for a while." Gideon looked at the paper. She'd sketched a rough layout, the lodge as it was, the outbuildings, the dormant garden. "The lodge has 10 rooms," he said. 8 of them are used maybe a third of the year when the railroad and business parties come through. "Which you would still host," Martha said. "That income matters, and those connections matter. I'm not suggesting you stop." She paused. "I'm suggesting that the other months the rooms don't have to sit empty." "And the garden," he said. "The garden is twice what you need for the lodge alone. If it were producing at capacity, it could feed considerably more people than are here now." She looked at him. "Corbett knows farming. He mentioned it. His family had a farm in Ohio before everything." Gideon looked at the sketch for a while. Martha let him look. "I've run this lodge on a particular model for 20 years, he said. "Hosting wealthy men, providing a comfortable stop for business travel, That's been, he paused, chose the word carefully, functional. It has been, she agreed. It's also been lonely, I'd imagine. He looked at her. The look was not defensive, which she appreciated. Yes, he said, it has. The model can change, Martha said. Not entirely, but the lodge can be more than one thing. Places usually can if you're willing to let them. He was quiet for a long time. She watched him think. He was a man who thought visibly, whose face moved through things when he was working something out, and she had come to find this, over the months, one of his more appealing qualities. He was not a man who performed certainty. If we're going to do this, he said finally, I want to do it right, not halfway. If families are coming here, if workers are coming here, I want there to be something real for them, not just a place to sleep and feel sorry. That's what I want too, Martha said. What does right look like? She picked up the pencil. Tell me what you have and what you can build, and I'll tell you what right looks like. They talked until well past midnight, which was becoming a habit. The formal proceedings against Halverson concluded in June. Douglas Halverson was convicted on 3 counts related to the supply fraud: the falsification of delivery records, the financial conspiracy that had run the system, and 1 count that the territorial authorities had pursued with particular focus: complicity in the concealment of Clara Blackthorne's death. He was sentenced to 7 years in the federal penitentiary at Colorado. The sentence was, by some measures, insufficient. Martha knew this and didn't pretend otherwise. 7 years for 20 years of deaths, for 31 names, for a woman who had trusted her records to a traveling laborer and been silenced before she could do anything with her own courage. But it was not nothing. And Douglas Halverson, who had spent his adult life in the comfortable assumption that men with enough money and enough distance between themselves and their decisions were immune to consequences, was going to spend 7 years understanding that he had been wrong about that. Corbin received 4 years. Price, as Martha had anticipated, received a substantial fine and a suspended sentence, which was the outcome of having better lawyers than the situation deserved. 3 other Halverson Company officials received varying sentences. The company itself was dissolved by court order, its contracts terminated, its remaining assets directed in part toward a fund for the families of the documented victims, something Aldrich had fought for specifically and that Martha had written to him twice to support. Not every family got what they should have gotten. The fund was not large enough. Some families were too far away to navigate the process effectively. Some of the death record corrections hit bureaucratic obstacles that Perkins's office was still working through in the summer. Ruth Carver's correction was processed in May. Joseph Crane's sister received her correction in July. 4 of the 31 families had no surviving members Martha could locate to notify, and those 4 names sat with her in a specific way, the particular weight of a truth that had been found but had no one left to receive it. She wrote those 4 names on a piece of paper and pinned it to the wall above her kitchen work table. Not as a memorial exactly, more as a reminder that completion was not the same as resolution, that doing everything you could do and having it be insufficient were not contradictions, but were simply the actual conditions of the world. The Mountain House opened, as it came to be called, in September of that year. It was not an opening in any official sense. There was no ceremony, no announcement beyond word of mouth, and the letters Martha had been sending for 8 months. The first guests were a woman named Dorothea Marsh and her 2 children, whose father had died in a logging camp 4 years earlier, and whose death record had been corrected in April. They arrived on a Wednesday afternoon looking tired in the particular way of people who have been managing alone for too long, and Martha showed them to a room on the east side with 2 beds and a view of the ridge, and she fed them supper, and the children ate with the focused intensity of hungry people who were too polite to say they were hungry, and Martha put more on the table without comment. The second guests were Harold Vess, finally well enough to travel after the medicine deliveries at Greystone had been regularized under federal oversight. He stayed 2 weeks. He didn't talk much the first week. The second week he started helping Corbett in the garden, which had been expanded over the summer with the addition of 2 new beds and a proper cold frame for the fall planting. He was good with his hands, it turned out, had grown up farming, same as Corbett, and by the time he left, he and Corbett had designed a drainage improvement for the lower bed that would keep the spring melt from drowning the early plantings. "You don't have to go," Martha told him the morning he left. "If you need more time." "I know," he said, "but I think I need to go back. There are men at Greystone I told I'd come back to." He paused, looking at his boots, then up at her. It's different now, with the deliveries right, with the federal men who check. But someone still needs to watch. Someone who knows what it should look like. That's true, Martha said. I thought maybe... He stopped, considered. I thought maybe that's something I could do, just being someone who knows and watches. Martha looked at him, this man who had been sick and angry in a northern logging camp 8 months ago, who had talked to a young ranch hand named Corbett and decided, on the evidence of a single conversation with someone willing to listen, that it was worth speaking up. I think that might be the most useful thing anyone could do, she said. He left on the morning wagon. She watched him go from the porch and thought about the strange routes by which people found their purposes. By October, the lodge had hosted 11 families in the rooms that had been empty in prior years. Some stayed a few days, some stayed 2 weeks, some came once and didn't come back, and some wrote letters afterward and some didn't, and Martha tried not to assign success or failure to either outcome. People needed different things and took what they needed, and she tried to provide what she could and release the rest. The business parties still came, the railroad men, the contractors, the territorial officials making their way up the mountain for the particular combination of good food and private conversation that the lodge had always offered. Martha cooked for them with the same attention she brought to everything. Gideon hosted them with his usual contained efficiency. But the quality of the lodge had changed in some way that even the business parties seemed to sense without being able to name. There was a different weight to the place, a different kind of presence, as if the walls had absorbed something of what had happened in them and now held it. One railroad executive, a man named Caulfield, who'd been coming to the lodge for 3 years, remarked on it over dinner one evening. "Different here this fall," he said. He wasn't unfriendly about it, just observational. "Different how?" Gideon asked. Caulfield thought about it. "More occupied," he said, which was not quite the right word, but was in the direction of one. "Like the place has more going on in it than it used to." "It does," Gideon said. Caulfield looked at Martha, who was pouring coffee. "The cook's permanent now?" he said. "The cook is permanent," Gideon said. Martha did not smile, but she noted the word and kept it. The hard conversation came in November, the way hard conversations often did, not at a planned moment, but sideways, in the middle of something ordinary. They were in the root cellar together, taking inventory of the winter stores, which was a task that involved a lot of lamplight and cold air and numbers. And Martha was writing down quantities while Gideon counted. And in between a count of dried beans and a count of preserved vegetables, he said, without particular preamble, "Are you all right?" She looked up from her notebook. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's been a year, since Caldwell Crossing, since all of it." He set down the jar he'd been counting. "I know what's kept you occupied. I know why. I'm asking about the part underneath." It was, she thought, a harder question than it appeared. She'd been asked variations of it over the year, by Edna, in her oblique way, by Ruth Carver in a letter, once by Corbett with all the graceless sincerity of someone who hadn't yet learned that some questions needed more careful delivery. She'd answered them with some version of "I'm managing," or "it takes time," because those answers were true enough. Standing in the cold root cellar with the lamp making shadows on the stored-up evidence of the season's work, she tried to do better than that. "Some days I think about Thomas and it's clean," she said. "Just grief, just missing him. That's bearable. That's what grief is supposed to be." She paused. "Other days I think about the 8 months he worked for that company knowing something was wrong and not knowing what to do about it. And She stopped. He wasn't a man who could ignore a wrong. He was also not a man who knew how to fight the kind of people who ran that operation. He was caught between those two things, and it killed him, and I can't—" She stopped again. "You can't stop being angry about it," Gideon said. "No, I can't." "Good," he said. She looked at him. "I don't mean it's pleasant," he said. "I mean, I spent years trying to resolve what happened to my mother into something I could be at peace with, and the trying itself was wrong. You don't make peace with something like that. You carry it, and you do what you can, and you let it be what it is." He picked up the jar again, turned it in his hands. "The anger is honest. The anger means you understand what actually happened. I'd be more worried about you if you didn't have it." Martha thought about this for a moment. "You've gotten better at saying things," she said. He looked mildly startled. Have I? When I first met you, you were the kind of man who communicated primarily in the direction of his coffee cup. You've improved. He almost smiled. You've been a disruptive influence. I've been called worse, she said, and went back to her notebook. They finished the inventory. The numbers were good. Enough for the winter. Enough for whoever came to the mountain house needing a warm room and a decent meal. When they came back up through the root cellar door into the cold November air, the sky was the particular deep blue of a clear, high-altitude evening, the kind of blue that looks like it goes on forever in both directions. Gideon latched the root cellar door and stood up and looked at the view down the valley, and Martha stood beside him. They were not standing particularly close. They were just two people on a hillside looking at the same piece of country, which was in some ways its own kind of closeness. I want to put a marker somewhere, he said. For her, my mother. He paused. Not a grave. There's nothing to bury. But something. A place on this land that knows her name. Yes, Martha said. We should do that. There's a clearing up the ridge. She used to... When she'd come to visit before, she always walked up to that clearing. Said you could see 3 mountains from it on a clear day. He paused. I haven't been up there in 20 years. Spring, Martha said. When the road clears and the ground is workable. We'll go up together. He nodded. I want to add Thomas's name too, she said. If that's all right. He looked at her. Of course it is, he said, and the simplicity of it, the lack of qualification, felt like the most generous thing anyone had said to her in a long time. The stone marker went up in May, on a Saturday when the weather was cooperative and the ridge clearing was as promised, 3 mountains visible, sharp and white against the spring sky. They carried the stone up themselves, Gideon and Martha and Corbett and Edna Foss, who had volunteered without being asked, and who worked harder than anyone on the uphill carry. The stone was not elaborate, a piece of native granite from the ridge itself, wide and flat, with 2 names carved into it by a man in town whom Gideon had paid to do the work carefully. Clara Blackthorne. She knew what was right and she did not stop. Thomas Whitlock. He carried the truth without knowing its name. Martha read the words twice. She had written them, had worked on them for 2 weeks trying to find the right formulation, which was harder than she'd expected, harder than any of the letters she'd written to the families, because those letters had an external purpose, but this was only for the 2 of them. And for the 2 people the stone named, and getting it wrong would have been a particular kind of failure. She thought she'd gotten it right. Or right enough. Edna brought food, because Edna always brought food, and they ate in the clearing with the 3 mountains around them. Corbett was quieter than usual, which Martha took as a sign of genuine respect from a young man who defaulted to noise. The sky stayed clear. After they ate, the others drifted a little way apart in the natural way of people giving each other space, and Martha stood near the stone and was quiet. She was thinking about what Gideon had said in the root cellar, that you didn't make peace with certain things, you just carried them and did what you could. She'd been turning that over for 6 months, checking it against her experience of the year, and she thought he was right, but she also thought it was incomplete. You carried it, yes, but carrying it changed over time. The weight didn't get lighter. She didn't think that was the right way to describe it. It was more that you got stronger, not in a triumphant way, but in the way a body adapts to sustained load. The grief for Thomas was still grief. The anger about how he died was still anger. But she had built something around both of them, or alongside them, and the building had given her a different kind of structure than the grief alone had provided. The mountain house was that structure. The 11 families who had come through it. The letters she still wrote and received. Harold Vess watching the supply deliveries at Greystone. Ruth Carver, who had written last week to say she was thinking of moving to a town closer to the lodge because she'd found, over the past year, that the distance felt wrong when what you wanted was to be near people who understood your particular history. None of it reversed what had been done. She had understood this from the beginning, and she hadn't let herself forget it, because she thought forgetting it would have been a way of cheapening the truth of what had happened. Thomas was dead. Clara Blackthorne was dead. 31 men were dead. The record had been corrected, and the names were now accurate, and the man responsible was in a federal penitentiary, and none of that brought any of them back. What it did was something else, something she was still finding words for. She thought about the woman she had been on the morning she left Sulphur Creek with a broken wagon and a cast-iron pot and a recipe card and 11 months of unanswered questions. She had been a particular kind of alone, not the ordinary loneliness of a woman living by herself, but the specific isolation of someone carrying knowledge that felt too large for one person and having no place to put it. That feeling of having nowhere to put a thing that was too heavy to carry alone. She understood now why Clara Blackthorne had handed a locked box to a stranger. Not because she had run out of options, though she had, but because some truths are too large for one person to hold, and the only answer is to find someone else to hold them with you. Gideon came to stand beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. And it was true, in the specific way that things are true when they are not simple. She was all right in the way of someone who had done what needed doing and was still standing, which was the most honest definition of all right that she'd found. "The Harmon family is coming Thursday," he said. "The ones from Bitter Creek. I know. I have their room ready." She paused. "The younger son. He's 18, the letter said. He's been working to support his mother since his father died. He's probably exhausted. What do you need for him?" "Mostly for people not to require anything of him for a few days. And food. 18-year-olds doing heavy work need more food than you'd think." "I'll tell Corbett." They stood for a moment more. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The clearing held what it held. "I want to ask you something," Gideon said. "And you don't have to answer right now. You can take time." "Ask," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the old habit of finding words carefully. "I've been thinking about what this place is becoming, what you've made it into, what we've made it into, and I—" He paused. "I've been alone in this lodge for a long time, longer than I understood while I was doing it, and I find I don't want to be alone in it anymore, and I also don't want—" Another pause. "I don't want to be only the man who owns it and you the woman who cooks in it. That doesn't fit what this actually is." Martha looked at him. He was not a man who made declarations easily, and this was as close to one as she suspected he'd ever come. "No," she said. "It doesn't." So, she agreed. It was not a romantic resolution exactly. There were no performances in it. Two people in a clearing in May, somewhere past the midpoint of their lives, having already lost the people they'd loved and done the hard work of building something in the aftermath, they had earned the right to be direct with each other. "I'd like to stay," Martha said. Not as the cook, as— She thought about the right word and settled on the simplest one. "As the other person who runs this place." "Yes," Gideon said. "That's what I'm asking." They walked back down the ridge together, not in a hurry. The stone behind them with its two names in the clearing with the three mountains, the lodge below growing larger as they descended, smoke from the cookhouse rising straight up in the still May air. The mountain house, as it came to be known through the territory, was never large. It was never prosperous in the way that business alone measures prosperity. Some years the roof needed work, and the money was tight, and Martha wrote fewer letters because the lamp oil was running low and she was being careful. Some years the garden failed partway through a dry summer, and Corbett's face went worried, and everyone ate less meat than they'd planned. Some of the families who came stayed too long and strained the stores. Some of the men Gideon invited for the business parties turned out to be men they didn't want at the table, and figuring that out after the fact was its own problem. It was not a perfect place. It was a working place, which is a different thing. What it was, over the years, was a place where people who had been told that what happened to them didn't matter came and were told, by the simple evidence of attention and a warm room and someone who knew their story and had written it down carefully, that it did. Martha was 44 when she drove 41 miles on a broken axle to a cooking competition she wasn't going to win, carrying a recipe card and 11 months of grief and a fury she hadn't yet found a shape for. She was not, by any measure, a woman with obvious resources. She had no legal training, no political connections, no money beyond what was needed, no powerful name. She had what she'd always had, the ability to pay attention, the willingness to do the next necessary thing, and a stubbornness that the people who'd underestimated her had consistently mistaken for simplicity. The people who'd laughed at her in the fairground tent in Caldwell Crossing were no longer present in any meaningful way in her life. She did not think about them often. When she did, it was not with the satisfaction of vindication. She'd learned that vindication was mostly a feeling that wore off quickly and left you where you'd started. What she thought instead was that they had been looking at a woman with a cast iron pot, and a cracked axle wagon and had seen the surface of things, which was all most people ever had time to see. The surface of things was not where Martha Whitlock lived. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look for witnesses. It shows up before dawn and figures out the coals and keeps the fire steady and listens carefully to what people say when they think no one important is listening. It writes 11 letters on a kitchen table by a low lamp and then writes 11 more. It drives 41 miles on a broken axle because someone needs to, and then it does the thing that needs doing next. It is not the courage of grand gestures. It is the courage of continuance, of deciding day after day that the truth matters, and that the work is worth doing, and that the people who've been made invisible deserve to be seen. It doesn't guarantee a good outcome. It doesn't protect you from loss. It doesn't bring back the people you've loved. What it does is build something, slowly, imperfectly, with difficult materials and in difficult weather. Something that can hold other people when they need holding, something that lasts beyond the building of it. That was the Mountain House. That was Martha Whitlock. That was what a woman nobody expected anything from made of everything she had, which, it turned out, was exactly enough.